Are you the nanny? That question, so casual, so polished, hit like a slap across the first-class cabin. Dr. Celeste Monroe didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't even lift her eyes from the boarding pass she had just tucked away. She simply exhaled, quiet and steady. But 5 minutes later, the airline would be flagged. 7 international airports would cancel cooperation, and $1.2 billion in ESG funding would vanish from their books. All because of that one question. This isn't just a story about a flight. It's about assumptions, silence, and a woman who didn't need to prove herself because she had already built the rules everyone else played by. Tell us where you're watching from, because what happens next might just change the way you see power. Flight 722, Geneva to Washington, D.C., was boarding on time. The first-class cabin had that quiet hum of controlled comfort. Leather armrests, half-poured champagne flutes, and passengers who wore their money like a second skin. Dr. Celeste Monroe entered with effortless poise. She wore a tailored navy suit, silk scarf, and the kind of diamond stud earrings that whispered legacy, not trend. In her right hand, she held a slim leather carry-on. In her left, the small, warm fingers of a boy with a messy afro and a Spider-Man backpack, her 9-year-old grandson, Elliot. They moved like they belonged, because they did. Celeste had just stepped off stage the day before in Geneva, keynote speaker at the Global Health and Ethics Summit, where she'd addressed leaders from 42 countries on the future of medical equity and ethical accountability in travel systems. She wasn't just attending the summit. She had written the ethics charter they signed, and she was going home. But in 2A, her seat, a storm was already waiting. A woman sat across the aisle in 2B. Silver hair in a soft French twist, pearl earrings, cashmere cardigan in slate blue. She was flipping through a financial magazine when she glanced up, then did a double take. Celeste helped Elliot into the window seat beside her, buckled him in with gentle ease. He immediately pulled out a Sudoku puzzle and started chewing on his pencil. That's when the woman leaned slightly toward Celeste, offering a practiced smile. "You must be the nanny," she said softly. "Is his mother joining us later?" The silence that followed was sharp, like a pin dropped into crystal. Celeste didn't answer, not out of confusion, but by choice. The woman tilted her head. "I mean, it's just so sweet. Traveling with a child. Parents must be so relieved to have you handle the flight." There it was again. That tone. That polished prejudice dressed up as small talk. Celeste knew it well. She'd met it in boardrooms where she wasn't greeted until after the CFO arrived. She'd sat across from investors who shook her assistant's hand before hers. But this moment was different. Elliot was here, and he was watching. He didn't seem to be listening, still focused on his puzzle. But children feel things before they understand them. She wasn't going to let this pass like all the others. Not this time. Her fingers slid gently toward the pin on her lapel. A discreet silver globe. It wasn't jewelry. It was a biometric key. She pressed it twice. A soft chime in her earpiece confirmed the secure line was open. "Dr. Monroe?" said a calm voice. "Laura McConnell, Deputy Director of Global Ethics Council." Celeste's voice was low and steady. "Flag Aurora Air Flight 722 under PII Protocol. Effective immediately. No emotion, no elaboration." "Understood," Laura replied. "Initiating downgrade now." Celeste ended the call and placed her hand back on Elliot's seatbelt, tightening it slightly. Still not a single glance toward the woman across the aisle. That woman, meanwhile, had no idea the wheels she'd just set in motion. Back at Aurora Air's headquarters in New York, an automated alert popped up in bold red. "PII status change. Immediate risk flag. Passenger Integrity Index downgraded. Non-compliant." The internal chain reaction began. 7 international airports, including Heathrow, Zurich, and Dubai, suspended landing cooperation for Aurora flights. 1.2 billion in ESG investment agreements were frozen pending compliance review. And in 48 hours, the CEO of Aurora Air would be standing in front of cameras, forced to sign a new industry-wide charter to keep his airline in the air. All because one of his passengers assumed the most powerful woman on that plane was there to serve juice and babysit. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. A businessman in 1C lowered his newspaper, eyeing Celeste. A young flight attendant stiffened behind the galley curtain, her eyes flicking from the woman in 2B to Celeste with dawning horror. Then a voice spoke from behind. "Excuse me, are you Dr. Celeste Monroe?" Celeste turned calmly. A man in his 50s leaned forward from the row behind, eyes wide. "I saw your session yesterday at the WHO summit. Your keynote on travel equity was brilliant." "Thank you," Celeste replied, offering the first smile since boarding. The woman across the aisle went pale. She looked back down at her magazine, but her hands were shaking now. Elliot looked up, confused. "Why is everyone staring at you, Nana?" Celeste leaned in and brushed a hand across his curls. "Because sometimes, baby," she whispered, "they recognize you too late." He nodded like it made perfect sense, then returned to his puzzle. The woman across the aisle never spoke again. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. But silence, in that moment, said everything. The hum of the engines grew stronger as the aircraft pulled down the runway. The world outside the windows blurred. And somewhere between Geneva and Washington, something far bigger than a flight path began to shift. At exactly 10:19 a.m. Geneva time, a single data packet blinked across the Aurora Air Secure Channel. It was quiet, invisible to the outside world, but its meaning was seismic. Passenger Integrity Index status, downgraded to non-compliant. Triggered by Global Ethics Council, Chair, Dr. Celeste Monroe. Action level, immediate. Inside Aurora Air's International Operations Hub in New York City, the alert landed on a bank of screens in the Risk and Compliance Unit. Red, blinking, persistent. No one spoke for a moment. Then came the voice of Curtis Lang, the airline's chief compliance officer, who had been reviewing an unrelated fleet maintenance report just seconds earlier. "What the hell does that mean?" His assistant scrolled rapidly. "Passenger Integrity Index downgrade. We're flagged by GEC." Curtis sat forward. "By who?" His assistant blinked. "Dr. Celeste Monroe. It's a level 1 trigger." A silence swept over the floor like a chill. Everyone in aviation compliance knew what a level 1 trigger meant. You could survive a bad press cycle. You could even smooth over a viral passenger incident. But when Celeste Monroe downgraded your airline on ethics grounds, you lost airports, you lost investors, you lost credibility. By 10:26 a.m., Heathrow Airport suspended Aurora's inbound access, citing pending integrity review. By 10:28, Frankfurt followed suit. By 10:33, Zurich, Dubai, and Narita joined. Then came the kicker. Geneva International, the very airport where Celeste had just spoken 24 hours earlier, blocked Aurora's ground operations until further notice. Within 15 minutes, 7 international hubs had either delayed or canceled Aurora Air's gate permissions. The dominoes were falling. Back on the flight, Celeste was sipping ginger tea. Calm, her posture still flawless. The woman across the aisle had grown almost still, like someone trying not to breathe too loudly. She kept her eyes fixed on the pages of a travel magazine she hadn't turned in 20 minutes. The young flight attendant who had been observing from the galley quietly stepped closer to Celeste's row. Her voice was almost a whisper. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I just wanted to say thank you. I watched your speech last night online. My cousin is in medical school because of your scholarship program." Celeste gave her a small smile. "Then tell her to finish strong. We need her." The attendant smiled back, eyes glistening slightly, then returned to the galley, posture straighter than before. Elliot looked up from his puzzle, confused. "Why do people keep thanking you on the plane?" Celeste touched his shoulder gently. "Sometimes," she said, "people remember who helped build the room they're standing in." By 10:45 a.m., Aurora's stock had dropped 6.3% on early investor reactions. By 11:10 a.m., 3 ESG funds, Greenflow Capital, Athera Holdings, and the Pact Fund issued immediate notices of suspension of all Aurora-related positions. One of the notices read, "In accordance with our ethics investment policy, we are halting capital deployment into Aurora Air until its status with the Passenger Integrity Index is restored." Inside the Aurora boardroom in Midtown Manhattan, CEO Stephen Rule had just finished a pitch call when his assistant burst through the glass door. "Stephen," she said, holding up her phone, "it's not just one airport. 7 have blocked us. ESG funds are pulling capital. And..." She paused. "And what?" he snapped. She turned her screen toward him. CNN breaking. Airline flagged for passenger ethics violation by GEC. Chair Dr. Celeste Monroe. Cites bias. Incident. A photo appeared beneath the headline. Grainy, but unmistakable. It was Celeste, seated on Flight 722, her eyes fixed calmly ahead. Beside her, Elliot, looking out the window. Across the aisle, frozen in mid-sentence, was the white woman in pearls, mouth slightly open, hand gesturing in that unmistakable way only certain people do when they're explaining something they shouldn't. Rule's face went pale. He picked up his phone and dialed legal. "I want this contained in 10 minutes. "It's not containable, sir," said the general counsel on the other end. "Dr. Monroe's chairing the platform that defines the very system we're now out of compliance with." "Then fix it." "You don't fix her, Stephen. You sign whatever she gives you and pray she accepts it." By noon, an emergency meeting was called with Aurora's executive team. The PR team was already preparing a drafted statement of apology. Legal was working with outside counsel to navigate reinstatement options. The CEO of Greenflow Capital had already declined Rule's call. In that meeting, a junior advisor said quietly, "Why didn't anyone recognize her at boarding?" The room went silent. Someone else added, "This wouldn't have happened if the flight crew had known who she was." And then Curtis Lang, the compliance officer, shook his head. "No," he said. "This happened because they assumed she couldn't possibly be who she was." Back on the plane, Celeste leaned back as Elliot began to nod off beside her, the Sudoku book slipping from his fingers. She looked out the window at the sky, her reflection faint in the glass. She didn't feel vindicated. She didn't need to. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, about reminding a system that invisibility does not equal irrelevance. That politeness isn't the same as respect. That you don't need to yell to shift an industry. At 12:45 p.m., Aurora Air's legal team received a formal copy of the Passenger Ethics Accord, drafted 3 years earlier by Celeste and approved by the FAA and GEC. They knew what it meant. Either sign and commit to full compliance, including retraining, public acknowledgement, and external audits, or risk being blacklisted by every international aviation body tied to the GEC framework. The front page had one signature already printed at the bottom: Dr. Celeste Monroe, Chair, Global Ethics Council. They signed by 4:10 p.m., and by 4:30, the story had gone global. On the flight, just before descent, the woman in pearls finally turned her head toward Celeste. Her voice was small, strained. "I didn't mean to offend." Celeste didn't answer. She simply gave her a slow, measured look. Not angry, not dismissive, just aware. And then she turned back to Elliot, still sleeping, and gently pulled the blanket up over his shoulder. The sun had just started to set over Washington, D.C., when the email hit every executive inbox at the Federal Aviation Administration. Subject: Passenger Integrity Index downgrade. Aurora Air, critical tier violation. Action required: compliance review and joint ethics response coordination. The attached file was only 5 pages long. But on page 2, bolded and highlighted, sat a sentence that made every reader sit up straighter. Incident initiated by GEC Chair Dr. Celeste Monroe aboard Flight 722, triggered under Authority Clause 9C. That clause hadn't been used in 6 years. The last time it had, 2 airlines collapsed within weeks. At FAA headquarters, Deputy Administrator Thomas Kellerman set his coffee down without sipping. Across the table, his chief advisor scrolled silently through the data. "This is bigger than one airline," she said finally. He nodded. It always is when Celeste gets involved. They both knew. When she pushed, she didn't just discipline, she redesigned. Meanwhile, in Brussels, the European Aviation Safety Agency, SA, received the same file. At the bottom of the attached document were these chilling metrics. 7 airports suspended cooperation. 3 ESG funds froze 1.2B. 1 global ethics downgrade. 24-hour media cycle expected reach. 92.6 million impressions. By morning, the impact would cross oceans. On social media, the story was already catching fire. Viral TikTok. Clip. This woman got mistaken for a nanny on a flight. 5 minutes later, she grounded 7 airports without saying a word. Icon. Trending X, Twitter. Thread. They didn't know who they were talking to. A quiet, elegant black woman in first class. Her name, Dr. Celeste Monroe, the woman who literally created the rules airlines follow. At Aviation Ethics Daily CNN headline, Ethics Queen grounds industry. Who is Dr. Celeste Monroe? Back at the Geneva International Airport Lounge, Celeste sat in a quiet corner with a small cup of tea. Elliot sat beside her, working through a coloring book of planets. The flight had landed 2 hours ago. They'd been greeted politely by staff, even offered an upgraded escort through customs. But Celeste had declined it all. She didn't want a spectacle. She just wanted her silence to finish its work. On the screen in front of them, a news segment flickered on. The anchor read carefully from the teleprompter. Aurora Air has signed an emergency agreement with the Global Ethics Council after being flagged as non-compliant by GEC Chair Dr. Celeste Monroe. The airline has agreed to new terms requiring mandatory anti-bias training for all flight staff, passenger interaction auditing, and quarterly ethics evaluations. Celeste didn't flinch, but Elliot leaned in. "Nana, is that about you?" She smiled gently. "It's about all of us, baby. But yes, I helped write that part." He sat back, clearly impressed. "That's cool." Celeste sipped her tea. "Power isn't always loud, Elliot. Sometimes it's a line in a contract, or a signature on a page." By 10 o'clock p.m. EST, Southbridge Airlines, a mid-tier U.S. carrier, issued a statement. In response to the ethics downgrade of Aurora Air, Southbridge Airlines is initiating an internal audit of our passenger treatment policies and partnering with the GEC for training and certification. By midnight, 2 more regional carriers followed. A quiet chain reaction had begun. The next morning, FAA HQ, Washington, D.C. Thomas Kellerman stood at the front of a press room with 12 microphones pointed at him. Behind him, the seal of the FAA gleamed under studio lights. He began slowly. Yesterday, the Global Ethics Council initiated a Tier 1 downgrade of Aurora Air under Clause 9C. As of 9 o'clock a.m. this morning, the FAA has issued a mandate. All U.S.-based airlines operating international routes must submit compliance documentation related to the Passenger Integrity Index within 14 days. Reporters buzzed. Hands flew up. One asked, "Is this a direct result of the incident involving Dr. Celeste Monroe?" Kellerman didn't dodge. Dr. Monroe reminded us, without saying a word, that dignity is not optional in flight. It's foundational. And when that dignity is ignored, systems, not just individuals, must respond. Across the Atlantic, in a quiet room in London's Heathrow Airport, the woman from 2B sat alone. No more pearls, no soft smile. Just silence and reflection. The news followed her. She couldn't escape it. A photo of her face, half-turned, lips mid-question, had become a meme. Not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. She opened her phone and typed into the search bar, "Celeste Monroe biography." The results hit like bricks. Medical ethicist, founder of Helix Health Systems. architect of the Passenger Ethics Index, advisor to WHO, UN, and EU transport commissions, chair of GEC, and then, finally, known for dismantling systemic bias with quiet precision. She put the phone down, and for once, she didn't have anything to say. Back at Celeste's home in Washington, D.C., a brownstone lined with ivy, tucked in a historic quarter just blocks from the Capitol, her phone buzzed again. An email from FAA Administrator's Office. Subject: Ethics Accord Revisions. Your eyes only. She opened it. Inside, a proposal to expand the Passenger Integrity Index into a permanent industry charter, binding across both US and EU flight carriers. The closing line read, "If you're willing, we'd like you to finalize the language and lead the public release." Celeste closed her laptop quietly. She looked out the window at the bare trees of late winter. Elliot was in the kitchen with her daughter now, loudly requesting waffles. She stood, poured herself a new cup of coffee, and whispered, "Sometimes silence isn't just a response. It's a reset." 3 days had passed since Flight 722 touched down at Dulles, and yet the story refused to land. Not on news feeds, not in boardrooms, not in the whispered meetings between airline executives desperately trying to understand how a single quiet woman had flipped the entire industry on its head. Without saying more than a dozen public words, in a 24th floor glass office in Midtown Manhattan, Elias Cho, senior partner at Concordia PR Group, scrolled through his client alerts. 9 airlines, 3 airport authorities, 2 major booking platforms. All wanted one thing: we need to get ahead of this Monroe woman. Elias rubbed his temples. "You don't get ahead of her," he muttered. "You survive her." Meanwhile, over in a small Washington, D.C. newsroom, Layla Bennett, a 27-year-old journalist for the Public Standard, sat in front of her editor, pitching harder than she had in months. "I'm telling you, this isn't just a flight incident," she said. "It's a systemic reset. The woman is rewriting the way the travel industry works, and no one's telling her story. They're just quoting press releases." Her editor raised an eyebrow. "You want to profile Dr. Celeste Monroe?" Layla nodded. "No fluff, no Queen of Ethics headline. I want to actually understand her." He hesitated, then handed her a folder. "Here, the last journalist who tried never got past her assistant." "I don't need her to talk," Layla said. "I just need to watch the pattern." While Layla began assembling her research, across the Atlantic in Frankfurt, a group of airport executives met with representatives from the Global Ethics Council. Celeste didn't attend. She didn't have to. They all had the document, the Passenger Ethics Accord, and it was no longer just a proposal. It was a precondition. Sign this, or lose alignment with PII. And if you lose that, the GEC rep said calmly, you lose trust, traffic, and your place in the global network. No threats, just facts. One by one, they signed. Back in DC, Celeste sat in her home office. Book-lined walls, soft jazz playing in the background, sun filtering through plantation shutters. She wasn't giving interviews. She didn't need a publicist. Instead, she reviewed quiet reports. Southbridge Airlines had implemented the full ethics compliance curriculum across 18 flight hubs. Athera Holdings unfroze $250 million in investment after Aurora completed its first independent audit. The FAA and ECA had jointly drafted a new addendum based on the accord, scheduled for international ratification in 60 days. The world was adjusting itself. All she had done was remind it. That afternoon, Layla finally found something no one else had followed. Not a photo, not a speech. A name. Kendrick Jameson. A military doctor, long retired, who had worked with Celeste in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. She cold-called him. He picked up on the second ring. "You want to know about Celeste?" he said. His voice was gravelly, but sharp. "Let me guess. You think what she did on that plane was new?" Layla paused. "Wasn't it?" He laughed. "Kid, she's been pulling entire systems out of the mud since you were learning the alphabet." He paused. You ever heard of the dignity drop? Layla frowned. No. That's because she doesn't brand her moves. She just makes them. You want a headline? Here's one. She reprogrammed an entire UN supply chain because someone refused to give her a key card. But she never told anyone. Layla was stunned. Why? Because power isn't what you say. It's what happens when you enter a room, and rules change without you needing to raise your voice. At a regional airline headquarters in Atlanta, a strategy meeting was in full swing. Executives debated loudly. One board member, tired of the back and forth, leaned in and said, "Gentlemen, let me say it plain. This isn't about diversity optics anymore. It's about compliance or collapse. And I suggest we follow the woman who wrote the playbook before she writes our obituary." That night, Layla published her story. Not a takedown, not fanfare, just a mirror. Headline: The Architect of Accountability, Inside the Quiet Power of Celeste Monroe. It went viral in 3 hours, not because of sensational quotes, but because it traced decades of quiet reform led by a woman who never chased credit, never raised her voice, but always got the room to move. Celeste read the article the next morning. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. But she forwarded it to her deputy with one note. She got it mostly right. The woman from 2B, unnamed in every article, blurred in every clip, was sitting alone on her terrace that morning, watching the story unfold on her phone. She read Layla's article twice, not because it shocked her, but because she realized something far more uncomfortable. She hadn't just misjudged Celeste. She'd never even considered that a woman like her could hold the room, because the room had never taught her to look for that kind of woman. And now, the room was rearranging itself. Elliot, curled up on the couch with Celeste, read the headline aloud. "Quiet power?" He looked up at her. "Nana, is that you?" She chuckled softly. "Sometimes." He looked back at the screen. "Can I be like that?" Celeste's hand found the top of his curls. "No," she said. "You'll be better." That same afternoon, the FAA, in coordination with the Global Ethics Council, formally announced the rollout of the Celeste Monroe Protocol, a cross-agency initiative requiring all airlines to implement passenger dignity training, real-time reporting mechanisms, bias incident auditing, quarterly ethics review tied to route certification, and at the bottom of the official press release, signed in bold letters, Dr. Celeste Monroe, Chief Author, Charter Lead. The press didn't get a quote, but the story already had its final word, and she didn't have to say it. They hadn't expected her to show up, which was strange considering her name was on the wall. At the Grand Hyatt Conference Center in Washington, D.C., 12 CEOs from the largest international airlines sat around a custom-made walnut table, shielded from the press behind closed doors and a heavily vetted invite list. They were there for the first ever Emergency Ethics Summit, co-hosted by the Federal Aviation Administration and the Global Ethics Council. The topic: Restoring Passenger Trust in Global Aviation After the Monroe Incident. Only, they didn't call it the Monroe Incident out loud. Not yet. At 9:02 a.m., the room buzzed as nameplates were adjusted, coffee poured, and lawyers reminded everyone to avoid direct quotes in case this gets leaked. One CEO, Richard Lang from Northeastern Sky, cleared his throat. "This meeting's purpose is to collaborate, not point fingers," he said. "We're not here to talk about who got flagged. We're here to make sure it doesn't happen to us." Someone chuckled nervously. Another said, "Look, I think we can all agree it was an unfortunate misunderstanding." A few heads nodded. Then a quiet voice near the back of the room interrupted. Was it unfortunate? Or was it inevitable? The room turned. There she was, Dr. Celeste Monroe, in a charcoal gray suit, scarf knotted loosely at the neck, eyes calm as water but sharp as broken glass. She had entered without announcement, without fanfare, just presence. The room went still. Some stood instinctively. Others froze halfway, unsure whether to rise or apologize. Celeste simply walked toward the head of the table, not rushing. When she reached her seat, the one labeled GEC chair, Dr. Monroe. She paused, removed the nameplate, and turned it around. It now read simply, "Passenger." She sat. No one spoke. Finally, FAA Administrator Thomas Kellerman, seated across from her, cleared his throat. "Dr. Monroe," he said gently, "we weren't certain you'd join us in person." Celeste folded her hands. "I wasn't certain either, but then I realized something." She looked up, meeting every man's eyes, one by one. "You're about to decide how to fix a system without inviting the people it failed." Silence. Then, from the far side of the room, a voice tried to steer the tone back toward neutral ground. "Dr. Monroe, with all due respect." She raised a hand, not sharply, just enough. He stopped speaking. She let the pause breathe. Every time someone says with all due respect, they're about to ignore what follows. Then she leaned forward. "I'm not here for your press strategy. I'm here because you've asked the world to trust a system you yourselves never question." Another beat. "Let me ask you something." Her voice stayed low. "When you picture a first-class passenger with a child, what do you assume?" No one answered, but the silence was, again, louder than 1,000 apologies. She pulled out a folder. Inside were pages of data, screenshots, transcripts. "I had your airlines audited, quietly. Not for delays, not for food, just one thing, perception. Who gets greeted first, who gets questioned, who gets downgraded, delayed, denied." She pushed the folder into the center of the table. "There are patterns," she said, "and they're not flattering." The CEO of Aurora Air, Stephen Rule, the man whose airline had been at the center of the original incident, spoke up finally. "We've implemented every measure you've recommended, Dr. Monroe. Ethics training, independent audits, passenger tracking. We even adopted the Accord before it was mandated." Celeste nodded. "I know. That's why I flew with you again last week." He blinked. "You did?" She tilted her head. "Row 7, seat D. Your crew didn't recognize me, but they didn't need to. They greeted everyone by name, offered blankets to every child, black, white, Asian. They looked passengers in the eye. No assumptions." She paused. "That's what reform looks like." Another CEO, this one from Eurosky Alliance, asked hesitantly, "So, what now? What exactly do you want us to do next?" Celeste tapped the nameplate she had flipped earlier. "I want you to sit in that seat, the passenger seat. One by one, say your name, your airline, and why someone should feel safe trusting you 35,000 feet in the air." They looked at her, stunned. "That's ridiculous," one murmured. Celeste raised her eyebrows. "Is it? Because every day, millions of people walk onto your aircraft, hand over their bags, buckle their children in, without ever seeing your face. They trust you, blindly. Now return the favor." She leaned back. "I'll wait." And one by one, they did it. Some stiffly, some sincerely, some visibly uncomfortable. But they did it. It wasn't for her. It was for the ghost of every misjudged passenger, every nanny who owned the seat, every silent mother, veteran, judge, child. By 11:47 a.m., the meeting was over. But something had shifted. Celeste stood, gathered her things, and walked to the exit without a backward glance. Only at the door did she pause. She turned slightly, just enough to be heard. "Next time you hold a meeting about restoring trust, start by inviting the people who lost it." Then she left. Later that day, Reuters published a quiet headline. She didn't raise her voice. She made the room speak instead. Back at her brownstone in D.C., Celeste sat on the porch with Elliot, sipping sweet tea while he explained the plot of his favorite comic book. "Nana," he said between bites of an apple, "did you really make all the airplane bosses talk?" She smiled. "Something like that." "Were they scared?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "They were reminded." The news hadn't stopped. Every morning for the past week, she had woken to a fresh headline, a new opinion piece, a different photo. Each one orbiting the same quiet storm. Celeste Monroe. But now the articles were changing. They weren't about the airline anymore. They weren't about Flight 722 or the ethics downgrade. They were about her. Not by name, never directly. Just the woman across the aisle. She had become a symbol, a cautionary tale, a shadow in someone else's rise. Her name was Margot Wexley. She was 63, retired finance executive, widowed, 2 grown children, a golden retriever named Baxter. She volunteered at a museum. She donated to causes. She considered herself aware, informed, open-minded. And yet, that moment on the plane, it kept replaying in her mind like a broken reel. You must be the nanny. Is his mother joining us later? She hadn't meant to offend. It was just a reflex, a thought she didn't examine before letting it slip. But now it felt louder than she remembered. Meaner, smaller, almost cruel. Her daughter, Emma, had called the day after the story broke. "Mom, was that you?" Margot had paused too long. Emma sighed. "I think you know you don't need to answer." That morning, Margot sat in her kitchen in Georgetown, stirring tea that had long gone cold. Her iPad was open to yet another article. Dignity doesn't always yell. Sometimes, it just rewrites the rules. The photos showed Celeste walking out of the FAA summit, her head high, no smile, no need for one. Margot studied her face. She wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She looked finished. Not with the world, but with needing it to understand. Later that day, Margot opened an email from the Passenger Integrity Forum, a new initiative sparked by the Ethics Accord. They were inviting passengers, especially those who had experienced or witnessed bias on flights, to participate in listening sessions hosted by the FAA and GEC. Margot stared at the screen. Her cursor hovered over the RSVP button for a long time, and then, quietly, she clicked yes. Meanwhile, across the city, Celeste sat in a round-table meeting with 3 advisors and a legal analyst from the United Nations. The goal: expanding PII into the humanitarian transport sector, applying the same dignity standards to global aid flights, refugee movement, and medical relief charters. No one in the room questioned her presence. In fact, they deferred to it. She didn't dominate. She didn't perform. She simply set the tone. Her power no longer came from the platform. It came from the fact that people had seen what happened when she was dismissed, and they weren't willing to risk repeating that mistake. That evening, Margot showed up at the FAA's public listening session. Held in a quiet university auditorium, the gathering was small. No cameras, no recordings, just open chairs and soft lighting. A facilitator welcomed everyone, then invited people to share. Margot listened as a young Latina mother talked about being asked if she was sure she had the right gate. A black veteran shared how TSA once pulled him aside 3 times in a row while his white co-worker walked straight through. Then the facilitator turned to Margot. "Would you like to speak?" She almost said no, then nodded. She cleared her throat. "I'm not someone who's experienced discrimination on flights," she began. "In fact, I've probably benefited from the opposite. I've always been treated as if I belonged." A few people nodded. Others just waited. Margot's voice tightened. "But recently, I was the person who made someone else feel like they didn't." Silence. "I didn't yell. I didn't insult. I just assumed. I saw a black woman with a child, and I assumed she worked for someone else." She exhaled. "And I said it out loud." No one interrupted. "I thought I was polite. I thought I was the good kind of passenger. But the truth is, I was just the quiet kind of wrong." Celeste didn't attend the session, but she received a transcript the next morning. She read it in silence. When she reached Margot's words, "I was the quiet kind of wrong," she paused, then highlighted the sentence. 2 days later, Celeste was invited to speak at a private industry workshop in Chicago. Instead of a keynote, she requested a small room with no cameras, just senior executives and crew members from various airlines. At the end of her talk, someone asked, "What do you want passengers to take away from all this?" Celeste smiled faintly. "I don't want them to fear consequences," she said. "I want them to feel the weight of their presence." Another executive asked, "And what do you want from people like the woman on your flight?" Celeste didn't name her. She just answered plainly. Not apology, not guilt, reflection. And after that, replication. Because dignity is only real if it becomes contagious. Back in Georgetown, Margot stepped off a flight for the first time since that day. She had taken coach. She'd asked for a seat beside a young mother flying alone. During the flight, she'd helped the woman settle her baby, handed over a spare granola bar, and asked her about her life, not her job. And when the plane landed, Margot reached for her bag, turned to the woman, and simply said, "Thank you for sitting beside me." At that exact moment, 30,000 feet above, Celeste was on another flight, this time to Nairobi, where she would advise the East African Air Transport Council on ethics integration. Elliot sat beside her again, flipping through a comic. "Are we going to fix their planes too, Nana?" Celeste laughed softly. "No, baby. We're just going to help people treat each other like they belong there." Elliot nodded, then said, "Do you think that lady from the other plane ever figured it out?" Celeste glanced out the window. "I think she's still figuring it out." They called it the Monroe Protocol. Not officially at first, not in the early drafts. In committee rooms and email chains, it was the Global Passenger Integrity Framework. But everyone knew. Every sentence, every clause, every audit mechanism. It all carried her fingerprint. The tone was hers. The silence between lines was hers. The language didn't shout, it insisted, and when it was time to unveil it to the world, there was only one name they wanted on the podium. The announcement was held at the World Transportation Ethics Assembly in Geneva, a full-circle moment, exactly 4 weeks after the incident on Flight 722. Delegates from 42 countries, CEOs from every major airline alliance, regulators, investors, and ethics committees all filled the conference hall. News cameras lined the walls. No red carpet, no orchestral swell, just quiet anticipation, and one empty chair at center stage. Backstage, Celeste adjusted the silver globe pin on her jacket. Laura McConnell, her longtime deputy at the Global Ethics Council, looked at her, smiling nervously. "They want a speech," Laura said. "The kind that trends." Celeste raised an eyebrow. "Since when have I cared about trending?" Laura smirked. "Since your silence grounded 7 airports in 5 minutes." Celeste chuckled. That wasn't trending. That was alignment. When she stepped onto the stage, there was no applause at first. Only a sea of people rising to their feet. It wasn't ovation. It was recognition. Some stood out of respect. Others stood because it felt impossible not to. Because when someone forces a global reset without yelling once, you pay attention. Celeste approached the podium. She didn't look down at notes. She didn't check the teleprompter. She just began. "A few weeks ago, I boarded a flight home. I sat in my seat. I helped my grandson with his seatbelt. I smiled, and then someone looked at me and decided what I wasn't." She didn't mean harm, but harm doesn't always come wrapped in hatred. Sometimes it arrives dressed in habit. That moment wasn't new, but what happened after was. Because we didn't shout, we didn't cancel, we clarified. We offered the industry a mirror, and the world chose to look in it. The Monroe Protocol is not punishment. It's preservation. Of trust. Of dignity. Of the basic truth that every human being, at 35,000 feet or 5 feet tall, deserves to feel like they belong. Not because they earned it, but because they're here. Silence. And then, slowly, applause. Not thunderous, not forced, but steady. Like rainfall, starting soft and then spreading. The protocol was rolled out in 3 phases. Phase 1, transparency. All airlines required to publicly release quarterly passenger ethics reports. Real-time feedback systems available on board for passengers to report microaggressions or bias-related behavior. Phase 2, accountability, third-party ethics audits tied to gate access at major international airports. Failure to comply leads to downgrade on the Passenger Integrity Index. impacting licensing, investor backing, and code share agreements. Phase 3, cultural shift. Mandatory training programs co-created with advocacy groups and passengers. Airline CEOs must complete a 2-day immersive passenger empathy simulation. A module Celeste insisted not be delegated. 3 airlines refused to sign. By the end of the week, 2 of them lost partnership status with the European airport network. The third issued a formal apology and reversed its decision. The message was clear. You don't get to opt out of dignity. That evening, Celeste walked alone through the cobbled alleys of Old Geneva. The conference had ended. The cameras were gone. She didn't like celebrations. They often came too early. What mattered wasn't applause in a room. It was policy in action. She stopped at a quiet cafe she used to visit during her early days consulting in Europe. The owner recognized her. "Same tea as always, Madame Monroe?" She smiled. "You remember." He poured it gently, then added, "My daughter's in aviation school. After your speech, she said she wants to be someone who designs what fairness feels like." Celeste paused. "That's a better job title than mine," she said. Across the ocean, Margot Wexley read the full Monroe Protocol online. She didn't skim. She read every line. Slowly. At one point, she placed her hand on her chest. Clause 32.1. All cabin crew must receive unconscious bias training grounded in real passenger narratives. These sessions will include direct accounts from affected individuals, anonymized but unfiltered. It was the first time Margot saw policy and heard her own mistake echoing back to her. In New York, a high school student named Leah Carter, 16, watched Celeste's speech from a cracked iPad in her bedroom. She didn't cry, but when it ended, she opened a new document and typed, "I want to study policy, not to talk louder, but to be the one who rewrites the rule book when people stop listening." The day after the protocol's release, Aurora Air ran a full-page ad in 5 global newspapers, black and white, no logo, just words. "We misjudged a passenger. She rewrote our standard. We're not embarrassed. We're grateful." Celeste received a personal letter the next morning. No return address, no signature, just typed and folded carefully. "I was the woman across the aisle. I know I may never earn your forgiveness, but I needed you to know I've changed how I move through the world because you sat still and let the world move around you." Celeste folded the letter, placed it in a drawer filled with dozens of others she never answered. She didn't need to. The protocol would speak louder than any reply ever could. Back in Washington, Elliot walked into the kitchen with a cereal box and said, "Nana, Ms. Jacobs at school told the class you changed the airline rules." Celeste raised an eyebrow. "Did she now?" "Yeah, she called you a legend." Celeste poured coffee slowly. "Well, I prefer citizen with standards." Elliot grinned. "That's too long for a superhero name." She smiled. "Good. Superheroes wear capes. I wear seat 2A. The Monroe Protocol had gone global. Within 3 weeks of its unveiling, 29 countries had adopted its framework into aviation compliance standards. 3 booking platforms, including Skyrate and Global Wings, added passenger ethics ratings next to every airline's flight. And in an unprecedented move, 2 international airport alliances required adherence to the protocol as a condition for gate leasing renewals. Celeste hadn't stepped onto a stage since Geneva. She didn't need to. Her words had already done the walking. But on a quiet Thursday morning, sitting on her brownstone porch with Earl Grey in one hand and a sleeping Elliot curled beside her, she got a call that made her sit forward. It wasn't from the FAA, not from the UN, not even from the GEC. It was from the office of the President of the United States. Her phone didn't ring. It pulsed, just once, and displayed the initials EOD. She exhaled, set her mug down. "Go ahead," she said into the line. "Dr. Monroe," came a voice calm and direct. "The President would like to meet. Tomorrow. Situation room. Discretion required." She didn't ask why. She knew. The next day, she was led through a quiet, secured entrance into the White House. No press, no ceremony. Just polished hallways and well-trained silence. Inside the Situation Room, a semicircle of national advisors, transportation officials, and security analysts stood as she entered. And at the head of the table, the president, sharp suit, tired eyes but focused, offered a respectful nod. "Dr. Monroe," he said, "thank you for coming." Celeste gave a soft smile. "I come when the work is real." He gestured to the seat beside him, then got to the point. The Monroe Protocol has done something no prior aviation reform could. It changed behavior without a scandal. It moved capital without coercion. It created dignity without a lawsuit. And now we need it in more than just airplanes. Celeste listened, unflinching. "We want you to expand the framework beyond aviation, into public infrastructure, healthcare, education. Build the National Human Standards Charter, a unifying dignity framework." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Why now?" The president answered without hesitation. "Because you didn't just fix a flight. You showed what happens when the system gets caught on the wrong side of someone with quiet power." She didn't accept right away. She asked for 72 hours and spent them not in meetings, but walking, observing. Subway stations, public hospitals, DMV lines. Not judging, just watching. And in each space, she saw the same patterns she had spent her career dismantling. Assumptions, dismissal, soft disdain wrapped in bureaucracy. She saw herself in the eyes of a young black nurse being spoken over by a pharmaceutical rep, in the quiet posture of an elderly woman being waved off at the passport office, in a janitor whose name tag wasn't read once in 4 hours of elevator rides. She returned to the White House 71 hours later and nodded once. "I'll do it, but not from a title and not from a desk." The president smiled. "We assumed you'd say that." Across the Atlantic, meanwhile, Layla Bennett, the journalist who had once chased Celeste's story, was now leading an entire media series on the Dignity Effect. Episode 1, How One Passenger Redefined Protocols in 19 Airports. Episode 2, The Quiet Ones Change Everything. Episode 3 would focus on the Human Standards Charter. When her producer asked her what made this story different, Layla replied, "It's not just change. It's undeniable change led without ego. That's what terrifies the old systems most." Meanwhile, a private meeting was held at Athera Capital, one of the ESG funds that had frozen then reactivated $250 million based on Monroe's index. Their new policy? No investment into any sector, public or private, that scores below 85 on the Integrity Compliance Index. At the top of that scoring system, Monroe Metrics, a new cross-sector ethics dashboard personally engineered by Celeste and her team. Back in her home office, Celeste reviewed the draft preamble for the new charter. It began with a quote someone else had attributed to her, without checking. "Dignity is not a reward. It's a precondition." She smiled faintly. Not because it flattered her, but because it reminded her of something her mother once told her. "You don't need to change the world, Celeste. Just make sure it doesn't change you first." On the final page of the document, she wrote a single new clause. Clause 101, the aisle test. All human systems must be built to honor the dignity of the person you'd least expect to sit beside you in first class. It was a nod. To the moment. To the woman. To the mirror that started it all. 2 days later, the Human Standards Charter was signed into preliminary federal policy. Pilot cities announced in Atlanta, Baltimore, Detroit, Oakland, and Newark. The rollout would begin in 90 days. No billboards, no campaign, just measurable change. Quiet, thorough, exacting. That evening, Celeste took Elliot to a jazz concert at the Kennedy Center. After the show, he looked up at her and said, "Is this what it feels like when the world listens?" She thought for a moment. "No," she said. "This is what it feels like when the world hears itself for the first time." It didn't arrive as a scandal. It didn't come with headlines, no hashtags, no outrage. It started with a form, a single complaint filed by a mother in Baltimore. She had taken her son to the city's new public health navigation hub, one of the pilot programs under the Human Standards Charter, and something felt off. The nurse never looked her in the eye. The staff kept calling her sweetheart, then ignoring her questions. And when she asked to see the explanation of benefits, a receptionist said with a smirk, "You people always make it complicated." She didn't yell. She didn't demand. She just scanned the barcode at the bottom of the charter poster on the wall and submitted a 10-line feedback. What she didn't know was that her form triggered a live, silent review. Because this was a Monroe system, and Monroe systems don't wait for things to explode. They record the tremor, then follow the vibration. 3 days later, Celeste Monroe received a sealed memo. No subject line, just the header. PII Integrity Alert. Baltimore Hub 04, Trigger Level, Tier 2. She was already dressed when the call came through. "We've initiated the Gray Visit Protocol," said a calm voice. "Would you like to send a proxy?" Celeste didn't hesitate. "No, I'll go in myself, as a mother." Baltimore streets were wet with leftover spring rain when she arrived. No entourage, no cameras. She wore a neutral trench coat, low heels, and a plain navy blue dress. Elliot was with his father for the weekend. For once, Celeste was just Celeste. At the front desk of Hub 4, she took a seat like everyone else. No one recognized her. She filled out a basic intake form using her mother's maiden name, Celeste Daniels. As she waited, she watched. There was an elderly man being told to try again next week, a pregnant teenager being lectured about Medicaid, and 2 nurses loudly chatting about how these people always show up late. Each moment was minor, nothing explosive, but altogether, the room hummed with soft disrespect. This wasn't a failure of procedure, it was a failure of tone. And tone, Celeste believed, was everything. When her name was called, she followed a nurse through the hallway. "Daniels?" the woman barked without looking up. Celeste stood. "Back there, second door. I'm not walking you." Still, Celeste smiled faintly and nodded. Inside, a technician asked questions but never once made eye contact. Then a doctor entered and spoke to the chart, not to her. "Vitals look fine. If you're just tired, try cutting sugar. I'll put you down for an iron test, but honestly, sounds like anxiety." He stood to leave before she responded. She gently asked, "Could I see my lab history before I go?" He sighed. "You can request that from records, but don't expect it quickly. We're swamped." She thanked him quietly and left the room. Back in her car, she tapped a code into a secure app. PII04 OBS complete. Trigger verified. She didn't speak to anyone on the drive back, but by the time she reached DC, 3 things had already happened. Hub 04 was downgraded to Ethics Watch List. All body cam and staff room recordings for the previous 30 days were auto-flagged. A peer review team was dispatched without warning. The public wouldn't know, not yet. But inside the system, the ripple had already begun. That night, Celeste met with her executive team over a quiet dinner in Georgetown. Her chief of field operations, a no-nonsense former Air Force strategist named Tanya Bright, leaned in. "You think it's just that one center?" Celeste shook her head. "No, but it's the one that thought the charter was a poster, not a practice. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't make threats. They outlined the next 90-day sweep. Covert observations, dignity audits, language tone analysis, and emotional neutrality testing. And at the center of it, Clause 101, the aisle test. Would you speak to this person differently if they sat beside you in first class? That was the charter's soul. And if a facility failed that, it failed everything. 3 weeks later, the results came in. Of the 5 pilot cities, 4 passed the test. 1 did not. Baltimore's Hubs 04 was issued an official ethics violation, not for medical malpractice, not for data breaches, but for failure to uphold patient dignity per federal protocol. It was the first time in U.S. history such a reason was written on a federal compliance report. The local news caught wind. At first, the story was small. Clinic receives federal ethics citation. But then national anchors started calling it what it was. The Monroe test has teeth. And for patients across the country, especially those like the mother who submitted the form, it sent a clear message. You're not overreacting. You're being seen. At home, Celeste sat in her study reading through follow-up reports. She paused on one, a letter from a nurse at Hub 04 who had resigned. It read, "I didn't know I was part of the problem until I watched the audit footage of myself. Thank you for making me look in the mirror before someone else had to." Celeste folded the paper gently. She didn't smile. Not quite, but she felt something settle. The next morning, she walked into her usual cafe in D.C. The barista, a young white woman in her 20s, paused, then lit up. "Dr. Monroe?" she said. Celeste turned. "My aunt's a nurse. She made our whole family watch your testimony last month. I used to think policies were boring, but watching you, it made me want to be better." Celeste's response was soft, steady. "Then the system's already working." The press wanted a quote. After the story broke that 7 major airports had formally suspended cooperation with Altavista Airlines, reporters flooded Monroe Foundation's D.C. office. They called it the first-class correction. But Celeste Monroe wasn't giving interviews. Instead, she sent out a single press release. 12 lines, no signature. Just the Monroe insignia at the top and one sentence that landed like a gavel. "Dignity is not elite, it is the standard." And just like that, the media storm didn't fade. It pivoted. A week later, the FAA met in a closed-door session to review the future of airline ethics compliance. Their internal report, leaked days after, carried an unexpected conclusion. Independent civilian audit systems, like the Monroe Standard, demonstrate more consistent enforcement of anti-discrimination principles than federal agencies alone. For Celeste, that wasn't a headline. That was leverage. And it was time to use it. In a quiet corner of a Georgetown cafe, Celeste met with Ava Delgado, the newly appointed chairwoman of the Aviation Policy Committee. Young, Latina, bold, but cautious. She had reached out. "I saw what you did with the airports. What you built doesn't just punish the bad ones. It teaches the rest how not to be next." Celeste stirred her tea slowly. "It only works if the rules have consequences." Ava nodded. "That's what I want your help with." She slid a folder across the table. The Passenger Dignity Accord, a draft federal charter. 8 pages. It needed a backbone. It needed Celeste's voice. 3 months later, in a packed Senate hearing room, Dr. Celeste Monroe stood alone at the testimony podium. Not as a victim, not as a headline, as an architect. Behind her, representatives from 7 airports, 3 airline CEOs, and even a union leader sat listening. She began with no fire, no dramatic buildup, just her voice. "I was mistaken for a nanny, not for the first time. Not because I looked lost or unsure, but because I existed in a space someone decided I didn't belong." She let the silence breathe. Then she continued. "That moment on the plane wasn't an incident. It was a symptom. And symptoms tell you the system is sick. I didn't respond with a press conference. I responded with policy." That line would later be quoted in textbooks. The Senate passed the Passenger Dignity Accord 89-11. It included real-time ethics dashboards for all U.S. carriers, mandatory unconscious bias training for all cabin crew, a 3-strike dignity violation threshold that suspends federal aviation funding, and most importantly, third-party public feedback portals linked directly to Monroe Foundation audits. For the first time, passengers had a voice that triggered real change, not months later, but mid-flight. Meanwhile, Jasmine Carter sat in her apartment, Malik asleep on the couch beside her, wrapped in a superhero blanket. The TV played a segment on the vote. Her name wasn't mentioned, but she didn't need it to be. The ripple she'd started had become a wave. She texted Celeste 2 words. "You finished it." Celeste replied 1 word. "We." By summer, Airports across the country displayed new signage. This airline complies with the Passenger Dignity Accord, audited by Monroe Foundation, real ethics, real time. And tucked beside it, on most flights, an unassuming QR code titled, "How was your seat treated today?" It didn't seem revolutionary, but it was, because silence wasn't invisible anymore. It left a trace. The ripple didn't stop with airports, or Senate hearings, or corporate apologies crafted by publicists. Something else was happening, something slower, quieter, but deeper. And it started where it always does, in the places no one films, and the conversations no one records. In the weeks after the Passenger Dignity Accord passed, Celeste Monroe noticed a shift in tone, not in headlines, but in halls, in elevators, in the pause people took before asking a question that used to come too quickly. The assumption wasn't always gone, but the entitlement behind it had cracked. She was invited to universities, not as a cautionary tale, but as a systems designer. Ethics labs asked for her framework. Law professors requested guest lectures. One dean whispered after her talk at Howard, "You didn't just respond to racism, you engineered accountability." But the part no one asked about was what it cost. In her own home, Celeste kept a folder. Inside it, the first headline that mistook her for a victim. The screenshots of comments under the news posts, some supportive, some slicing, and a printout of a message she'd received from a senior executive at a competitor. "You're making it harder for the rest of us." That line stayed with her longer than the applause. It reminded her not everyone was happy the system changed. Some were comfortable in the old rules, where silence was safer and visibility had to be earned. Even within her own board, tension simmered. Tanya Bright had to diffuse a conflict when two partners questioned whether Monroe Foundation had become too activist. Celeste didn't flinch. If protecting dignity is activism, we should ask why neutrality was ever considered noble. The board didn't push back again, but she knew the cost of her voice, and it wasn't just professional. One night after a late panel at Columbia, Celeste got back to her hotel and found a letter slid under the door. No envelope. Just a sheet of paper, typed, "You don't belong in first class, not because you're black, but because you make the rest of us uncomfortable." She sat with it in silence, then tore it in half and flushed it. She didn't mention it to security, or her assistant, or her son, because some attacks weren't meant to harm, they were meant to haunt. She wouldn't let them, but even pain can be re-engineered. The Monroe Foundation launched a new division, the Listening Archive. Anonymous reports from passengers, from crew, from janitors, from pilots. Not just stories of injustice, but stories of silent endurance, of small corrections, of quiet resistance. Celeste read every submission that first month. One stood out. I used to tell myself I was imagining it, the way passengers looked at me when I wore my natural hair on shift. Last week, for the first time, a passenger said, "I love that you're allowed to be yourself." I almost cried, not because of what he said, but because someone noticed. Celeste sent no reply, but she archived it herself and framed that sentence on her office wall. At a gala honoring civil rights architects, Celeste declined to speak. Instead, she handed the mic to Jasmine Carter, now a national spokesperson for equitable design. Jasmine didn't tell the story of the plane. She told the story of what came after. I was mistaken for someone lesser, not because I acted less, but because I looked like someone they'd decided couldn't possibly be more. And the most powerful part? I never had to explain myself. The system did. The room stood for her, not in sympathy, but in recognition. Late one evening, Celeste walked alone through Dulles International. The walls now held her accord. Screens displayed her ethics dashboard, but she stopped near gate C-17, watched a young mother, black, tired, hair in a messy bun, settle into a seat with her toddler. A businessman looked up, opened his mouth, then closed it. He nodded instead. Celeste smiled. It wasn't victory. It was progress. And sometimes, that's enough to keep walking. 2 months later, Celeste Monroe stood quietly by a window inside the newly renamed Justice Terminal at JFK International. Morning sun filtered through glass panels that now displayed quotes from the Passenger Dignity Accord, etched not just in steel, but in memory. Behind her, a crowd had gathered. Journalists, CEOs, student leaders, airline executives, and a few faces she recognized from that flight. A voice announced from the podium, "And now, we welcome the architect of the Accord and the woman who turned silence into structure, Dr. Celeste Monroe." She stepped forward, not with the weight of anger, but with the clarity of purpose. "I never wanted to become a symbol," she began. "But if my presence made people uncomfortable enough to look inward, then let that discomfort become design." The room quieted. No flashes, no coughs, just listening. It wasn't one question on one flight. It was every door that didn't open until I forced it. Every room that needed my resume before it respected my voice. This Accord doesn't fix all of that, but it makes it harder to ignore. She paused, then said something she hadn't shared before. "After that flight, I considered resigning, not because I was ashamed, but because I was tired. But my son asked me one question. 'Mom, if you stop now, who will keep the rules honest?' That got a quiet laugh. Then a few tears. So I stayed, and we rewrote the rules together." Applause followed, but softer than before. Not performative, respectful. Later that day, in a closed meeting with airline CEOs and FAA officials, Celeste signed the final clause of the Accord. A clause requiring every U.S. airline to adopt ethics-based passenger evaluation by Q3. She didn't linger for photos. She walked out, called her son from the car, and told him, "It's done." "For now," he replied, "until the next upgrade." Celeste laughed, and for the first time in months, it felt real. Outside the Justice Terminal, a small plaque had just been installed, in honor of every woman who was told she didn't belong, and stayed anyway. Celeste didn't need to take a picture. She had lived it. Do you think the woman across the aisle truly learned something? Or was it just shame? Let us know below. Would you have stayed silent like Celeste once did, or spoken up? What would you say in her shoes? If you believe stories like this can shift systems, type "dignity first" in the comments.